at the center of your heart and chant after me. Column response. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Thank you all for joining us. So Chaitanya Charan Prabhu, if you can, the verse. This is a beautiful verse from the Srimad Bhagavad Gita as it is. Chapter 6 and text number 5. Uddhare datmanatmanam natmanam avasadayet atmaiva hyatmano bandhur atmaiva ripuratmanaha.
One must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well.
Thank you all for joining today. And this is one of the most practical and important verses from the Bhagavad Gita, which essentially talks about how we can deal with our mind. And what it involves is, firstly, understanding the difference between us and our mind. To the extent we understand that difference, to that extent, we can work to use the mind to our advantage. So at a basic level, we could say what this verse means is that we have discussed this concept of 3 levels of existence. So we are the soul, and separate from us is our mind. Now, the mind, in one sense, is our link to the outer world. We could say here there's the body, beyond it, and then beyond that is the whole outer world. So from the mind, from the outer world, various stimuli come into the mind, and then through the mind they come to us. So now when we're just focusing on these 2 things, the soul and the mind, what this verse essentially is saying is that the mind can act in binary ways. The mind is not just a neutral transmitter of information. It is not just a transmitter of data that comes from the outer world. It also acts as an interpreter of the data. So for example, if somebody uses a strange look, immediately mind starts thinking, does this person hate me? Is this person plotting against me? If our boss gives a strange look, immediately the mind starts getting fearful. What is happening? Am I going to be fired? So the mind basically, so from what is coming from outside are perceptions. And the mind has impressions within. We'll talk about these 2 terms. Perceptions are basically the event that have happened outside. They come inside through the mind. But the mind does not just neutrally transmit them. There are impressions which are formed inside the mind from our past choices. And then what comes to us as souls, what the soul receives, is basically an unpredictable combination of perceptions and impressions. And because of that, because this product is a combination and it's an unpredictable combination, that means sometimes what we perceive might be what comes to the mind, what comes to the soul rather, might be, it could be 90% perception plus 10% impression. Or it could just be 10% perception plus 90% impression. That means, say, we see outside someone, and maybe in the past we have seen a person of a similar size, similar physical description who threatened us. And then when we see that person is not a threat, but the impression in the mind makes us think that it's a threat. So basically, what the Gita verse is saying is, we need to remember that this mind is different from us. And then either we can use the mind when it is guided and controlled. When it is guided, we can use it to do constructive activities and elevate ourselves. So we work as a unit with our mind, the soul and the mind. But if the mind is guided, then we can elevate ourselves, we can act constructively. But on the other hand, if the mind takes control, if the mind determines how we perceive things and how we respond to things, then the result of that will be that we will become, degraded. We will act in destructive ways, counterproductive ways. If the mind is guided, rather, if the mind takes charge, when the mind takes charge, then we will end up becoming degraded. So the idea is, distance yourself from your mind, understand that there is something different from you, and then act in a way that elevates yourself, that does not degrade yourself. So this is the essential depiction of what this verse is about. Any comments? Vedaji, Radha, Devi?
I like this concept very much. And one thought I had was, mind first gets misguided before it gets degraded. I think that there is that sometimes the process may be a little faster, sometimes the process is a little slower. So I always feel that when we listen to the dictation of the mind, then it has a tendency to misguide.
Yes, I put it this way: the mind first misreads and then it misleads.
Okay.
So,
and then degrade, possibly, yes.
yeah, when it misleads, so it first gets misguided, and then when it misleads, it degrades.
Okay, perfect.
So
Radha,
this is important. This difference is important to make, because we understand that the mind is not intrinsically our enemy. The mind is an important tool for us to function, just as the tongue is a tool for speaking, the eyes are a tool for seeing. So mind is a tool for thinking. Mind is the place where thoughts occur. So in that sense, functionally, it is essential. But just as sometimes when we speak, some people may stutter. Some people may stutter more than others. Sometimes we have slip of tongue. Sometimes it's a Freudian slip of tongue. And what we want to hide, we speak. But that does not make the tongue our enemy. So the mind is an essential tool for thinking. But because it has its own, based on its past impressions, it often interprets situations. And when it interprets situation, it may misinterpret situations. So then it can actually misdirect our thinking. So in this role, it is desirable. In this role, it is not desirable. So that's why we don't talk about rejecting the mind or suppressing or destroying the mind. We talk about reforming or purifying the mind. Yes, Radha Devi, you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking of a personal example here to maybe illustrate this point. In my own experience, I grew up I was a child of an alcoholic father, and he had a lot of great qualities. But that being said, when he was drinking, was not so nice all the time. And through that relationship, I came to kind of believe that I was never good enough, or I could never do anything right. Fast forward to 10 years, and I'm in like the dating world. And as my teacher Raghunath would say it, I had kind of a broken picker. I would pick people that were similar to that would reinforce that idea that I wasn't good enough, and that also drank heavily. So I was in one particular relationship with a person of these same personality traits for a few years, and it got to the point where I just was so low. I knew I needed to get some help. So I started going to a therapist, and the therapist was incredible, because what the therapist did, where we had kind of talked about a couple sessions ago, we talked about that space between stimulus and response. The therapist talked about the you can probably actually write this. It goes beliefs, thoughts, and then actions. So first you have a belief, and then based off of that belief, you have a thought, and then based off of that thought, you have an action. And so this is kind of how like your life plays out according to this Western psychology. So first we identified my belief was that I wasn't good enough. So then I was finding partners that reinforced that narrative, and then I was acting it out, and it was kind of going round and around. So the work that I did with a therapist was to kind of change that rooted belief of why I thought it wasn't good enough. So then that goes back to my childhood of this relationship that I experienced, and this narrative and all of these things. But this was such an aha moment for me that, like, wow, my mind is something that I can change, and I can choose if I want to trust or not. And it really, this experience with this therapist started to change the whole course of my life. I actually fast forward, 10 years after that, and now I have a husband who reinforces the opposite belief. He's like super supportive, always there, super reliable, to the point where now my work is not interpreting small things as big things, because my mind is so conditioned, but being able to like step back and see through this lens has been so crucial. And I think where the Bhagavad Gita would even play into this is after I started going down the rabbit hole so far as to like, okay, I don't think I'm good enough. What makes me good enough? Is it achievement? If I graduate top of my class, then am I good enough? I did that. No. If I'm really successful in athletics, then am I good enough? Did that? No. Like all these things finally get to the Bhagavad Gita. It's like, oh, okay. Now this is like the guidebook of really how to rewire my mind in a way that my heart, my body, my mind, I feel so integrated and fully connected. So that was kind of my experience with this concept in my personal life.
Chitamit, Prabhu, can you go up a little bit on the screen? I wanted to add something. Yeah, a little bit higher.
Just one point. Thank you for sharing this, Radha Devi. It's something which is so fundamental to us that, first of all, sharing your personal experience is very moving to hear. But along with that, this point about beliefs, the Gita says in the 17th chapter that in 17.134 that we are made up of our faith. That Shraddha Mayoyam Purusha. So we are now, when it is using the word faith, it is not necessarily using that in a religious sense. Essentially says that it's actually like a 3-level sequence, that we make our faith and our faith makes us. And in the interim, it is at present we are made up of our faith. That faith refers to our whole set of belief systems that we have. And in the Bhagavad Gita, generally without spiritual knowledge, this idea of when am I good enough, it depends on something extrinsic. And okay, I may not have a high IQ, but I have good musical intelligence. I may not be tall enough, but I'm good in this, I'm good in that. So we can keep oscillating based on extrinsic parameters if we are looking for that fundamental sense of self-worth. But the Bhagavad Gita gives us the intrinsic sense of self-worth, that as we are indestructible souls. And no matter what goes wrong in our life, our spirituality is never violated, it's never destroyed. And not only that, we are all loved by the divine. That we are eternally the parts of the divine. Mamai Vamsho Jiva Loke. This is 223. This 15:7. So essentially, this changing the fundamental beliefs that we have about ourselves is so important. Unfortunately, sometimes when we practice spirituality also, one of the common statements we say is, I am a fallen soul. And in this, sometimes we emphasize the fallen so much that we forget the part of the soul at all. I'm just fallen. And that can even reinforce the negative narrative. But the important thing is, so this is a very unhealthy way of looking at it. I am, yes, presently I may be fallen, but center, I am the soul. And as a soul, I'm pure. I am intrinsically a part of the divine. And this fallen is just a temporary condition right now. And that will change. So that way we can have a very, very unshakably positive belief about who we are and what we are meant to do. And that can help us.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, Vedaji.
So on this chart right here, no, go up a little bit more.
Up.
No, sorry, go down. A little lower. Yes, right here. I was just thinking when Radha Devi was speaking about her experience of growing up with an alcoholic father, how the circumstance, the association that she was exposed to as a child, she didn't have a choice to go anywhere other than be under the shelter of her parents, and how that circumstance and that association created this narrative in herself that she wasn't worthy enough. So this primarily, in my experience, I've noticed primarily is the mind's interpretation because of lack of experience and knowledge that we children we don't have. And so we interpret those situations and those experiences in ways that are quite destructive in our lives. And Bhagavad Gita, therefore, has been a big, huge light for many in the world to understand that those experiences that we have, they do not define the nature of the soul. And once we study from the Bhagavad Gita the true nature of the beautiful soul, and that the mind is simply an instrument, then it enables us and gives us the power to completely overcome and transcend those traumas and those repetition of life cycles that continuously overpower and overlap and pile up in our lives. So that's something that I was thinking as she was sharing that story.
Yes, thank you.
Wow.
And
That's wonderful too.
Sorry?
I said that's wonderful too. That's so helpful.
Yeah, I realized one thing that happened in my life, because my mind translated that in a similar fashion. You know, I left home when I was 5 years old, and my brother was 8 years old. And for the longest time in my life, I thought that I had this issue of like so-called abandonment, right? I always felt like people in the world will just abandon me. And soon enough, I realized, is this even true? Did my parents really abandon me? So then I asked my brother, who was 8 years old, and I said, hey, did my parents abandon us? He goes, no. But then I was like, why do I feel abandoned by them? And then finally 35 years go down the road, 35 years, and I get to ask my father as he's departing this world. I said, hey, did you guys really abandon us, me and my brother? And he goes, no, you guys are the ones that ran away from home. And we went and roamed around India for 2 years looking for you guys. And I was like, oh, really? And then just everything just switched, just like the light goes on. I was like, oh my God, look at my mind. For 35 years in my mind, I am sure that it was my parents who abandoned us. And they didn't care that we were not worthy. And one day it's all gone, because the mind's interpretation is a very, very, can be a very dangerous path that can lead us to a very dark space. So this is one of the things that I got from this text in the Bhagavad Gita. So thank you for your sharing, Radha Priti.
Thank you for sharing that words. It's quite scary to think about how, when we perceive the world, which part is our interpretation, our twist. And sometimes it's consciously done, and most of the time it's just unconsciously done. And when that happens, it's very difficult to know. I think this is one of the reasons why we'll talk about the solutions a little later. But the Gita talks about relationships as so important, healthy relationships. Because what happens is, a healthy relationships, at the very least, they give us a perspective that is an alternative to the mind's perspective. If we are all alone, then the only take we have on reality is what the mind is giving us. And because the mind is inside us, it's very difficult for us to distance ourselves from it. So, and especially if we have a really close relationship, then what happens? Normally, the soul is here. I'll just depict it like this. The mind is a little, just for depiction purpose, I'm saying the mind is big. And then all people in our life, they are over here separately. But when we start having a close relationship, then what happens is the soul is here, the mind is here, and let's call this person as a friend, guide is here. So then, instead of looking at everyone through the mind, so here, in this case, what everybody we are perceiving is through the mind. But here, what happens is, the mind is still speaking to us, but our friend, our guide is also speaking to us. And then we can check, okay, which version of reality makes more sense? And that is why this, now being able to do this involves two things. First is we have to distance ourselves from our mind, increase the distance between us, and there is proximity. This is where also one of the key teachings of the Gita is that we need I'm using the word friend here, but we need a guide, I need a guru. At the start of the Gita, Arjuna's mind was interpreting the whole of reality for him. And he was thinking, how can I fight? This is such a terrible thing to do. But then Krishna, as his guide, told him, yes, fighting is terrible, but not fighting would be even more terrible. And in that sense, the mind gives us an alternative perspective. Just to continue this theme, when I was born, when I was one, I got polio. And so my longest memory is that I never remember walking unaided. But one of my earliest memories of my disease condition is that some of my relatives would come, and some relatives had come to my home, and they told my mother primarily that, it's so sad that your son got polio. And my mother said that, whatever he lacks in physical ability, God will give him in some other way, in intellectual ability. And at that time, I was struck by two things. First is that, who is this God who determines such things? How does he have so much control over my life? But from that time onwards, I primarily defined myself not so much by my physical disability, but by my intellectual ability. And I was reasonably good in studies. So when people see me, the first thing they notice about me is that I need crutches for walking. But in my own self-conception, for me, basically the crutches are just as important as are my glasses. Now, I need my glasses for seeing, but okay, put on the glasses and get on with life. My glasses don't define me. And similarly, my crutches don't define me at all. So in that sense, I feel very grateful to my parents and my upbringing. Of course, still, even the identification of the intellect is also limiting in its own way, because you may identify yourself as an intellectual, but then always be people who are more intelligent than you, and that can cause us insecurity. Eventually, when Gita helped me to understand that I am a soul, so I was just drawing here what Veda was saying, that in our past experiences, they can shape our body and they can shape our mind, but they don't shape us as the soul. And to the extent we identify, it is for us to choose what we identify with. If we identify with the soul, then yes, the mind and the body, whatever they have gone through, that effect will reflect in the way we function, but it won't define us. So these affect us, but they don't have to determine us. They don't have to define us.
It's interesting that you heard that and you remember that when you were so young. Do you think if they would have said something different, like he's never going to be able to do anything well, and do you think that would have affected your mind differently? Do you think that became like a self-fulfilled prophecy, that you heard that and then you're like, okay, that's what I'm doing?
Yeah, I would say so. I never thought of it as a self-fulfilling prophecy, but yeah, I definitely, it has never been a part of my self-conception of myself. And although my parents did try to cure the polio, by that time it was incurable, more or less. But it didn't really affect me. So I'm sure that if they had spoken something else, it would have affected adversely.
Yeah, it makes me think like it's just so important who you choose to have around you, who you choose to spend time with, who you choose to hear from, because those narratives start to shape your mind.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Go up a little bit more on, okay, go up on the chart. I wanted to add something to that. Yeah, right here. You know, in the retreats that I do, which are the Chitta cleanse retreats, which is trying to find the virtues in our traumas, which is one of the things that I spent a lot of time with. I have this exercise that I do where we hear the sounds of the mind. We hear every desire. So we have this exercise when a person sits and is having a dialogue, because every time we are having a dialogue with someone, there is another person that is constantly talking to us. When we're in the shower, there is someone telling us, Veda, you are now showering, you are now walking, you are now moving your hands, you are now reading. And so constant repetition of every action is being narrated by the mind. And that's something that I have noticed in myself. So I train the students how to hear the sounds and carry on with being the soul, detached from the mind. Mind is simply another personality inside of you narrating every action. You are studying and the mind says, I am now reading. I am now typing an email. I have to take a phone call. Before every action, the mind is dictating all the actions. So we do this exercise, how to distance ourselves from the mind and simply observe the mind so that we can carry on with our lives, our sadhana, our daily routines, whatever our plan is, living our life from the space of Dharma, and let the mind do its thing. So this is something that we spend quite a lot of time doing, this separating the mind and the soul.
Yes, thank you for mentioning this. In fact, this is actually central to the verse. This phrase is often used in self-help psychology, self-talk. Now, it can refer to two different things. One is self-talk, you can say, is inner talk that is going on inside us. One is the mind talking to us. Us means we as souls. And the other is we talking to the mind, to our mind. So, in general, the mind is constantly talking to us. For example, right now, when I was writing this, I was thinking, oh, my handwriting is so poor. So the mind doesn't just report, it doesn't just repeat what we are doing, it actually also interprets. It's almost like one of my favorite metaphors for this is, say if this is a cricket ground. Now, cricket is a common game in India. You could use baseball or whatever. So this is a cricket ground and a match is going on. And here there's a commentary box and there's a commentator. So the mind is like the commentator. And this is the arena of our life. And this is our life where we are acting. But while we are acting, imagine if there's a cricket match going on and the cricket player who is, say, batting or bowling or fielding, the player has an earphone and the player is constantly hearing what the commentator is speaking. And imagine that just to take this further, commentator has a bias against the player. The player is batting very well, say, but performing very well. The commentator says, oh, this is just a lucky streak. Now, one wrong shot and everything is going to collapse like a pack of cards. Now, the player is actually feeling good, is confident, is performing, but the commentary is going on. Now, at that point, unless the player can shut off the commentary, the player will not be able to perform. So for all of us, our mind is constantly talking to us. You could say that this is, so in general, this kind of commentary is not healthy. We need to talk to our mind. Instead of the mind saying, okay, you are doing this and you are doing a lousy job. That's what the mind will say. Okay, yeah, I'm doing this and I'm doing it as well as I can. And as I practice, I'll improve. So to the extent we can take charge of our inner conversation. In fact, this verse, when it says, don't degrade yourself with your mind, I would say it's a 6.5. A part, B part of it. The verse has 4 parts, A, B, C, D. Natmanam avasadayet. That at least don't listen uncritically to what the mind is saying. And what it says is, actually elevate yourself with your mind. That means we start talking with ourselves. Now, we don't have to talk out aloud, but we take charge of the inner conversation. There are both ways. One is just distance ourselves. The mind is a chatterbox. We'll keep chattering, we neglect it. Another way to deal with it is we take charge of the inner conversation. So we become conscious. Okay, I'm doing this right now. For example, say I am speaking on the Gita right now. And yeah, my handwriting may not be good, but I'm working on it. It's improving. At least it's legible now. It's better than what it was a month ago. So to the extent first of all, we have to become conscious that if you consider distancing ourselves from our mind, now first we become conscious of the mind's presence and its speech, and then we evaluate. And then we counter it if required. So we first become aware of it, then we check it, and then we counter it if necessary. So that's how we distance ourselves.
Can we use another term? I like the word conscious you put. Can we say the observer?
Yes.
We
observe.
Yes.
And when we
because observer means you're away from the object itself.
Yes.
So that's why.
So actually, I for all of these, I like the word check. Check means to observe, check what they're doing. And check also means, has 2 meanings: observe and regulate. Check yourself, don't give in to it. So we need to check our mind regularly. And this is where I find that spiritual practices, or even 2 ways. One is that just taking regular breaks. If you're going through our day, just taking a regular breaks, maybe to chant a few mantras, to take a few deep breaths, to just introspect. That can be very helpful. Then we start understanding, okay, what is the mind speaking inside me? And is it really true? Is it helpful? So some kind of regular breaks, they can help us to create this, to observe ourselves. It's very difficult to observe ourselves constantly, but we can have regular breaks for self-observation. In fact, this is one of the characteristics of the mode of goodness, sattva guna, where a person functions by self-observation. Radhadevi, you want to comment something?
Yeah, could you go up a little bit? I was just thinking, this box, the self-talk. I was thinking, the goal is that we talk to our mind, and I think my hope is that if I talk to my mind enough, then it almost is like autopilot, like I'm changing the narrative of how my mind talks to myself, and then it kind of loops that way. It's like automatic. And one thing that I found really useful that I've been doing, which I always had such an aversion to because I'm just really terrible at, of like all things, I'm really bad at memorizing slokas. I struggle. And so I always just had an excuse for not doing it. But now I'm taking this course and I have to memorize these slokas. So I've started putting aside time and kind of pushing my way through it. But what I notice is different slokas come to me at different time, at different challenges. And they're just like so poetic and beautiful that they also have like an effect on my nervous system. Like they make me feel calm. So it's like not only the content in the sloka, but also the Sanskrit and the poetry. That's just like a tool I've been using that is kind of helping me with my talk to my mind. And then it becomes just in my head where it's like, that's how my mind is talking to myself. And it's just, again, just one of the spiritual tools that I found really useful in this.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Just to depict in the particular way, see, if this is the soul, and say this is the mind. So quite often, what happens to us is we want to go in one direction, and the mind wants to go in the opposite direction. So say you want to memorize verses, but the mind says it's too difficult. Why spend time on this? So then there's a lot of inner resistance, which consumes much of our energy. And this generally, if you consider any machine, if there's greater the friction is greater, then the output is naturally going to be lower. So for many of us, when our mind is out of control, when the mind is wild, we can say, it's a lot of friction. And that's why we end up being basically like a shadow of ourselves. And we underperform because of this inner friction with the mind. But over a period of time, what can happen is that the mind just becomes silent. So one is the mind becomes silent, and the soul's energy, our intention just moves forward straight. And there are times when we can just get completely focused. There is no distraction at all. And now this is one way. Sometimes this is, psychologists call this being in the zone, peak performance mode or something like that. But even better could be that we are here and our mind is also positively excited and energized about something. Then in that sense, this is our energy, and the mind also adds to that energy. Sometimes our excitement about something increases our focus. So you could say this is the place where the mind becomes our friend. This is the place where what we want to do, what is good for us, the mind is also excited about it. And then we all can be so much better versions of ourselves. So these two areas is where we elevate ourselves with the mind, especially the third level, where the mind starts working with us instead of against us, or for us instead of against us.
So in this verse also there's a solution to this, right?
The solution: elevate yourself with your mind. Don't degrade yourself. The mind can be your friend, and the mind can be your enemy.
Rasa and Vairagya, those two words.
Oh, that comes a little later. I think that's an important part to discuss. So the Gita talks about the mind in several verses in it. If you consider what we discussed just now as 5, 6, all the 6 chapter of the Gita, that's what we are discussing now. Then again it talks about in 25, 26. And then again it talks about 33, 34, 35, 36. So what we discussed was the 5th verse. Now the solution part, let's discuss the 35th verse. There, it said that how do we actually deal with our mind? It talks about 2 things. In the Gita, Krishna acknowledges that actually the mind is very difficult to control. It's a very empathic acknowledgement that we are all facing a formidable task. But it talks about 2 things, abhyasa and vairagya. Now these are Sanskrit terms and they can be understood in different ways. Practice, that's the normal translation. And then we have detachment or non-attachment, we could put it that way. The way I like to put this is, it's feeding and fencing. So like I said, the mind is a tool for thinking. So we need to have a working relationship with the mind. So we could say this is, let's put it this way. So here, say here, if this is the soul, here is the mind. So if we try to become like a parent, we don't hate our child, certainly we love our child, but that doesn't mean we let the child control its own life or our own life, our life. We know we have to guide the child. So when we do this, if we consider a parent has 2 primary roles in taking care of and growing the child: feed the child, nourish the child through good, healthy, nutritious food, and then fence, protect the child. The child cannot, while playing, go on the road. A vehicle may run over, some people may abduct. So feeding and fencing, these 2 are key things. So for the mind, what we are trying to understand is now that there are these impressions inside the mind, and those impressions form our beliefs. They give rise to our desires, our thoughts, our feelings. Now these impressions, whatever they have come from the past. We want to change them. So suppose for somebody, these impressions are mostly dark. They're mostly negative impressions. So what we want to do is, we want to change them. We want to bring more positive impressions over. So that could mean, yes, there are those negative impressions. You can't remove them entirely, but maybe we start creating some positive impressions. And that means the abhyasa. So for example, when we, in the Bhakti tradition, we study the Bhagavad Gita, we chant the holy names, we associate with, we chant the mantras, we associate with pure-hearted people. All this starts creating positive impressions within us. So abhyasa is basically, we ensure that this is abhyasa. We expose ourselves to stimuli that will create positive impressions within us. So you can just call it simply positive stimuli. So to the extent we have regularly exposed ourselves to positive stimuli, they will create positive impressions. And now these impressions that are inside vairagya, what it would mean is that whatever impressions are there inside us, these can grow in 2 ways. One is, if from outside something comes in, that means something reinforces the negative that is there inside us. And the second is when we act out on them. So vairagya has both these aspects to it. Vairagya means that we create a distance, we distance ourselves, distance from toxic stimuli. And in some ways, what comes outside in is, relatively speaking, easier to control. Not always possible, but it's possible. Say if somebody has a script that, oh, I'm just an alcoholic, that's the only way I get relief. But then if they're going to associate with people who, yeah, they the downplay alcoholism, nothing wrong, it's just a way to enjoy life. What's the big deal? Then that will reinforce that. Or will say, oh, alcoholism, I tried it many times, I cannot give it up. Better just live with it. Then that is something which is coming in. So distance ourselves from those toxic stimuli. That's one, the first aspect of it. And the second aspect of it is that restrain impulsive indulgences. Now, it's not, again, both of these may not be possible immediately, but whatever is possible. Every time we act, suppose I feel angry and I vent my anger, then not only am I reinforcing my notion that I'm a short-tempered person, I have anger issues, I just can't control my anger. But even one time, if I just restrain myself, okay, I was about to yell at someone, and maybe I started speaking a sentence, and suddenly I realized I calm myself down. So every time we restrain, then we are not feeding these unhealthy impressions, we are rather starving them, and they will weaken. So this is the way we gradually change our mind, by abhyas, by creating fresh impressions, and by vairagya, by starving the negative impressions. Yes, Vedi. Whether you want to speak something?
Yeah, I thought it's very beautiful, Krishna explaining these two steps. And one of the things that I focus a lot on is I do a lot of gardening, which is, of course, a very important part of earthing, or some people call it electromagnetic therapy. And
Gardening is electromagnetic therapy.
yes.
Really? Okay.
It's a big thing in the world. And part of the retreats, we do this gardening. So in my own garden, every day I go check on the seeds that I plant, and I water them. I make sure that the squirrels don't go and pick out the seeds. There's no other entities coming. So it becomes like a daily routine. So it becomes my daily sadhana. So it's important to make sure that we have a certain habit every day to protect what is of value to us. So like in our daily lives, we have our sadhana. Many of the students who attend the retreats, they understand the importance of sadhana, seva, and sangha. So the sadhana is the daily nurturing of the beautiful self within this body. And so that is the sadhana part. And of course, we put a little fence around to make sure that, the birds don't come, and other elements are not impeding the growth of this beautiful self inside. So in this abhyasa part, I find it to be one of the biggest instruments in changing the narrative of the mind. Because the mind is constantly telling us, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this. And multiple excuses are given. But this non-stop abhyas, the non-stop daily sadhana, regardless of what happens, our sadhana becomes like the oxygen of our lives. So this abhyas and vairagya are like this beautiful flow of oxygen, the two nostrils that enable the sustenance of this body. And that comes through our daily sadhana, this abhyas, this practice. So I find that this solution that Krishna gives, sometimes when we do yoga, we understand the Ida and Pingala with the two nostrils, the masculine, feminine energy, these two parallel tracks. So these two steps, to me, I find it to be extremely powerful in dealing with the mind.
Beautiful. So while you're talking, I was thinking about how these Abhyasa and Vairagya correlated with specific limbs in gardening also. In a gardening, we have seeds which we want them to grow. Like that, we have some positive narratives within us, or we want to grow the positive narratives within us. That's the Abhyasa part. And weeds, we want to starve them. We either want to prevent them, we want to uproot them, we want to remove them. That's the Vairagya part. Yes, gardening is a beautiful example. And in fact, this is a separate topic, but I'll just quickly mention something about it. The Gita is filled with metaphors drawn from nature. You know, ocean, turtle, fire, then like that. There are dozens of metaphors which the Gita uses. And in fact, the enlightenment by the natural path is one of the themes of the book that follows from the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavad Puran. So I think that is the metaphors we can draw on in our future sessions also to talk about how to understand and internalize, apply the principles of the Gita. So Radhadevi, you want to add something before I summarize?
No, that was really beautiful. I was just thinking about how fortunate we all are to have this text in our lives, and how, you know, in the advice that I often get in the material world, you know, it's like self-care is like going and getting a massage or getting your nails done, or just like it's things that, you know, may feel good for a little bit, but like this is just such profound wisdom that starts to change like the wiring of your heart, which is so much more sustainable and profound, that I'm just so appreciative of the knowledge and you both here sharing it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the Gita is a great treasure. I think it has enriched all our lives, and that's why we are here trying to share that enrichment with others. So I'll quickly summarize. So we discussed on the Gita. First, we discussed about separating ourselves from our mind, how the soul and the mind are different, and with the mind we can either elevate or degrade ourselves. And to that extent, in that direction, we discussed the point about how what makes the mind the way it works. So you talked about beliefs that shape our actions, and those beliefs come from impressions. So the mind, what it does is, when it is giving us information, it is a unpredictable combination of impressions and perceptions. And that's why it is important for us to distance ourselves. That's when we can perceive it. So then we talked about distancing ourselves. Distancing can be done various ways. Example of a cricket player and a commentator. So changing the nature of our self-talk by self-observation. So I talked about the word check. Check means to both observe, evaluate, regulate. It means multiple things. So we check ourselves regularly. And then we talked about for changing the mind's narratives, changing the mind itself. The distancing is important to create, to ensure that we don't just act out unhealthy beliefs, but how do we go further than that? That is, by treating it like a child, we feeding, that is abhyasa, the practice, we feed healthy narratives, healthy beliefs, and then fencing it from, that is vairagya. So fencing it from the unhealthy. And this way, that same mind which was opposing us, that will start supporting us. And then that can help us elevate ourselves, become better versions of ourselves. Anything I missed out you want to add before we finish?
Perfect. We need to zoom back out so we can see everyone.
Thank you so much.
If we put them in big, deep yoga nidra.
Thank you both.